see man as a rather dismal creature.
Why not? Look around. You'll see what's there. Fear and frightened people who kill what they can't understand.
Yo, my chumers, doomers, and troomers. What's up? It's V here, opening up for Pierre Tru-Dank. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been waiting a long fucking time for this video. So when I say it better be fucking preem, it better be fucking preem. Anyways, take it away, Pierre.
So the title George Sorel ANCAP Marxist is part insight and part clickbait, because while many try to pin him as a fascist renegade, I've always thought that when reading Sorel he came across almost as a right-wing libertarian, which likely is because of the influence from both Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Alexis de Tocqueville, and is further evidenced by his frequent rants on regulation, protectionism, and top-down centralized systems which try to subjugate production towards a certain perceived social good, all while being a staunch and yet very heterodox Marxist. As a self-professed Marxist, he was an adherent to historical materialism, yet borrowed other ideas from the Third Republic milieu with figures such as Bergson, Durkheim, and Renan. He developed the idea of myth as a method towards collective action, and that myths have been the driving force of social movements in history. He studied Vico and the idea of civilizational recursi, or recurrences, and believed that the proletariat in taking power and formulating new juridical concepts for civil, public, and criminal law would be a moral catastrophe, upsetting the old decadent civilization that would signal a new recurso, like the sublimation of Roman law into Germany during the 15th century. George Sorel was a syndicalist who believed in a socialist society comprised of large, self-governing industrial syndicates, as well as Proudhonian contractualism as a supplement for bourgeois legal code. This at least is my interpretation of Sorel when reading him, but perhaps before delving into these concepts further, I should begin with a basic biography of George Sorel. George Sorel was born in 1847 to a petty bourgeois wine merchant family. He grew up when France was becoming a modern democratic nation, and during a time of reaction under the 20-year rule of Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, when the great financial bourgeoisie had constructed the infrastructure of modern France. He would study engineering at the École Polytechnique, a state technical school, and at the age of 20 work for the Department of Roads and Bridges. Sorel would remain an isolated individual at the State Engineering Corps, and during the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune, he was working in Corsica and later in Algiers. After 25 years of service and isolation from modern France, he would retire from the Engineering Corps, move to Paris, and live life as an intellectual. In 1894, he contributed greatly to L'Ère Nouvelle and the first French Marxist journal, and later would form Le Devenir Social with Paul Lafarge, who was Marx's son-in-law, Paul Bonnet, the founder of L'Ère Nouvelle, and Georges Deville, who first translated Capital into French, which is to say very important figures in French Marxism. The period of Sorel-Proudhon was a desperate period for Sorel. After the democratic compromises within the CGT, Sorel would become disillusioned with syndicalist politics and was at this time mostly concerned with the degenerative aspects of the Third Republic's culture and institutions that the strategic alliance with Action Française seemed appealing in order to reinvigorate French bourgeois society with a vigor that had been lost by the bourgeois decadent turn towards social peace. Sorel-Proudhon, however, to the extent that Sorel was involved in it, was only to secure a good position in the French political landscape for his disciple Edouard Berthe. In 1910, a book review critical of a book written by Charles Péguy was published in the Action Française newspaper, without Sorel's knowledge, leading people to believe he embraced the ideas of the monarchist and nationalist right in France. Sorel, however, despite some engagement with Action Française, could never fully align himself with Charles Maurras because of their disagreements over nationalism and monarchism. By 1914, Sorel was vehemently opposed to the war, as well as the Union Sacrée, which forbade strikes during wartime. And by 1917, Sorel was a supporter of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and would write his Defense of Lenin article, which he would publish into a later edition of Reflections on Violence. He would also write this postscriptum at the end of Materials for a Theory of the Proletariat in 1918. This book was not printed until 1918. The war has posed new problems which I dare not broach at this time. Only one point seems certain, that the victory of the Entente was a triumph for demagogic plutocracy. This plutocracy wants to suppress the Bolsheviks who frighten it. Its military forces are sufficient to carry out this operation. But what will the plutocrats gain by the extermination of the Russian revolutionaries? Will not the blood of the martyrs be effective once again? One must not forget that without the massacres of June 1848 and May 1871, socialism would have had great trouble in making this principle of the class struggle acceptable in France. The bloody object lesson which will take place in Russia will make all the workers feel that there is a contradiction between democracy and the mission of the proletariat. The idea of constituting a government of producers will not perish. The cry, "Death to the intellectuals," for which the Bolsheviks are so often reproached, will perhaps end by imposing itself on the workers of the entire world. One must be blind not to see that the Russian Revolution is the dawn of a new era. By 1922, he passed away, giving us no insight into his thoughts on the rise of fascism in Italy, although according to his correspondence with an Italian liberal, his thoughts on fascism were quite negative, while possibly having praised Mussolini earlier in 1919 in private. He gives brief insight into his thoughts on the Russian Revolution, but not on Lenin's governance nor Stalin's. According to Larry Portis's book, George Sorel requested that a black flag be placed on his coffin, demonstrating his hostility towards the Third Republic. For George Sorel, the idea of myth is the driving force behind collective action, organized into social movements. Myths are constructions of images of the total triumph of the cause which drive the actions of the people engaged. In the course of these studies, I have established something so simple that I did not believe it had to be emphasized. Men who participate in great social movements represent their immediate action in the form of images of battles, assuring the triumph of their cause. I proposed calling these constructions myths, the general knowledge of which is so important to the historian. The syndicalist general strike and Marx's catastrophic revolution are myths. I have given as remarkable examples of myths those which were constructed by early Christianity, the Reformation, the French Revolution, and by Mazzini's followers. I wanted to show that it is not necessary to try to analyze such systems of images in the same way that one breaks down something into its elements. They should be taken as a whole and as historical forces, that it is necessary above all to keep from comparing the accomplished facts with the images which men had adopted prior to action. Sorel points out the existence of collective myths in the history of Christianity, the Reformation, the French Revolution, and also in Mazzini's followers, as well as Marx's catastrophic revolution and the general strike of the syndicalists. Myths thus of a total victory stand in contrast to utopias, which inspire only passivity and the belief in inevitable progress. Myths, however, are a call to action and impress amongst the people the belief that progress is a result of conscious human effort. As long as there are no myths accepted by the masses, one may go on talking of revolts indefinitely without ever provoking any revolutionary movement. This is what gives such importance to the general strike and renders it so odious to socialists who are afraid of revolution. They do all they can to shake the confidence felt by the workers in the preparations they are making for the revolution, and in order to succeed in this they cast ridicule on the idea of the general strike, which alone has a value as a motive force. One of the chief means employed by them is to represent it as a utopia. This is easy enough, as there are very few myths which are perfectly free from any utopian element. The revolutionary myths which exist at the present time are almost pure. They allow us to understand the activity, the sentiments, and the ideas of the masses as they prepare themselves to enter on a decisive struggle. They are not descriptions of things, but expressions of a will to act. A utopia is, on the other hand, an intellectual product. It is the work of theorists who, after observing and discussing the facts, seek to establish a model to which they can compare the existing societies in order to estimate the amount of good and the amount of evil they contain. It is a combination of imaginary institutions having sufficient analogies to real institutions for the jurist to be able to reason about them. It is a construction which can be broken into parts and of which certain pieces have been shaped in a way that they can, with few alterations, be fitted into a future legislation. Whilst contemporary myths lead men to prepare themselves for a combat which will destroy the existing state of things, the effect of utopias has always been to direct men's minds towards reforms which can be brought about by patching up the system. It is not surprising, then, that so many believers in utopias were able to develop into able statesmen when they had acquired greater experience of political life. A myth cannot be refuted since it is, at bottom, identical to the convictions of a group, being the expression of these convictions in the language of movement, and it is, in consequence, unanalyzable into parts which could be placed on the plane of historical descriptions. A utopia, on the other hand, can be discussed like any other social constitution. The spontaneous movements it presupposes can be compared with those actually observed in the course of history, and we can in this way evaluate their verisimilitude. It is possible to refute it by showing that the economic system on which it has been made to rest is incompatible with the necessary conditions of modern production. Myth is an expression of the convictions of the group and drives them to action. Utopias, on the other hand, are only tools to measure how much good and bad exists in the world. Utopias only motivate reforms in the belief that progress is inevitable. It is therefore necessary for the revolutionaries to inspire the masses with myth if they want to gain victory. Violence, in Sorelian terms, is action that disrupts the capitalist system. Strikes are violent because they halt production, and while there may be violent confrontations, this does not define the violent nature of the strike. The danger which threatens the future of the world may be avoided if the proletariat hold on with obstinacy to the revolutionary ideas, so as to realize as much as possible Marx's conception. Everything may be saved if the proletariat, by the use of their violence, manage to re-establish the division into classes, and so restore to the bourgeoisie something of its energy. That is the great aim towards which the whole thought of men who are not hypnotized by the events of the day, but who think of the conditions of tomorrow must be directed. Proletarian violence, carried on as a pure and simple manifestation of the sentiment of class struggle, appears thus as a very fine and heroic thing. It is at the service of the immemorial interests of civilization. It is not perhaps the most appropriate method of obtaining immediate material advantages, but it may save the world from barbarism. To those who accuse the syndicalists of being obtuse and ignorant people, we have the right to ask them to consider the economic decadence for which they are working. Let us salute the revolutionaries as the Greeks saluted the Spartan heroes who defended Thermopylae and helped preserve civilization in the ancient world. Violence is considered by Sorel to be a sort of rejuvenating force, as it provokes the bourgeoisie out of passivity and inclines them to use force against the workers, which accelerates into an eventual ultimate victory on the part of the proletariat. The alternative which we are faced with today is the influence of the bourgeois socialists to allow the bourgeoisie to exist in a state of passivity and appease the workers with reforms leading to a period of economic decadence. Any action, therefore, which disrupts the workings of the system and social peace is in service to the interests of civilization, as it acts to halt economic decadence. Today, the main force of creative violence seems to be the libertarians, who aim to greatly free social life from the state and accelerate the division of classes. Pessimism for Sorel is greatly inspired by his Jansenian upbringing. What is meant by pessimism is often greatly misunderstood. In the excerpt below, Sorel compares pessimism with disillusioned optimism, and criticizes the role optimism plays in politics. So little are we prepared to understand pessimism that we generally employ the word quite incorrectly. We wrongly take pessimists to be disillusioned optimists. When we meet a man who, having been unfortunate in his enterprises, deceived in his most legitimate ambitions, humiliated in his affections, expresses sorrow in the form of a violent revolt against the bad faith of his colleagues, the stupidity of society, or the blindness of destiny, we are disposed to regard him as a pessimist, whereas we ought nearly always to regard him as a disheartened optimist, who has not had the courage to rethink his ideas and who cannot understand why so many misfortunes have befallen him. In contrary to the general law governing the production of happiness, the optimist in politics is an inconstant and even dangerous man, because he takes no account of the great difficulties presented by his projects. These projects seem to him to possess a force of their own which tends to bring about their realization all the more easily, as, in his opinion, they are destined to produce more happiness. He frequently thinks that small reforms of the political system, and above all of government personnel, will be sufficient to direct the movement of society in such a way as to mitigate those evils of the modern world which seem so hideous to sensitive souls. As soon as his friends come to power, he declares that it is necessary to let things alone for a while, and not to be too hasty, and to learn to be content with whatever their good intentions suggest. It is not always self-interest that dictates these expressions of satisfaction, as people have often believed. Self-interest is strongly aided by vanity and by the illusions of poor-quality philosophy. The optimist moves with remarkable ease from revolutionary anger to the most ridiculous social pacifism. Here the pessimist is regarded not as one who is disillusioned with the world and intends to wage a revolt, rather is contrasted to the optimist who believes his reforms will realize human happiness all by themselves. Optimists are very volatile politically because at one instant they can be filled with the utmost revolutionary anger and the next be filled with social pacifism. This is most exemplary of the Biden leftists who under Trump were spouting revolutionary rhetoric and immediately shifted to talk of social peace and reform when Joe Biden was elected to office. Pessimism is quite a different thing from the caricatures that are usually presented of it. It is a metaphysics of morals, rather than a theory of the world. It is a conception of a march towards deliverance that is narrowly conditioned, on the one hand, and by the experimental knowledge that we have acquired of the obstacles which oppose themselves to the satisfaction of our imaginations, or if one prefers, by the feeling of social determinism. On the other, by a profound conviction of our natural weakness. These three aspects of pessimism should never be separated, although as a rule little attention is paid to their close connection. 1. The concept of pessimism derives from the fact that literary historians have been very struck by the complaints of the great poets of antiquity, about the sorrow and pain that constantly threaten mankind. There are few people who have not at least once experienced a piece of good fortune, but we are surrounded by evil forces which are always ready to spring in ambush and overwhelm us. From this are born the very real sufferings by which arouse the sympathy of all men, even of those who have been treated most favorably by fortune. Hence the literature of grief has had an appeal throughout almost all of history, but we would have a very imperfect idea of pessimism if we considered only this kind of literature. As a general rule, in order to understand a doctrine, it is not sufficient to study it in an abstract manner, nor even as it occurs in isolated people. We need to find out how it is manifested in historical groups. It is for this reason that I am here led to add the two elements that were mentioned earlier. 2. The pessimist regards social conditions as forming a system bound together by an iron law which cannot be evaded, as something in the form of one block, which can only disappear through a catastrophe which involves the whole. If this theory is admitted, it then becomes absurd to attribute the evils from which society suffers to a few wicked men. The pessimist is not subject to the bloodthirsty follies of the optimist driven mad by the unforeseen obstacles that his projects meet. He does not dream of bringing about the happiness of future generations by slaughtering existing egoists. 3. The most fundamental element of pessimism is its method of conceiving the path towards deliverance. A man would not go far in the examination either of the laws of his own wretchedness or of fate, which so shock the ingenuousness of our pride, if he were not borne up by the hope of putting an end to these tyrannies by an effort to be attempted with a whole band of companions. The Christians would not have discussed original sin so much if they had not felt the necessity of justifying the deliverance, which was to result from the death of Jesus, by supposing that this sacrifice had been made necessary by a frightful crime attributable to humanity. If the people of the West were much more occupied with original sin than those of the East, it is not solely, as Taine thought, due to the influence of Roman law, but also because the Latin peoples, having a more elevated conception of imperial majesty than the Greeks, regarded the sacrifice of the Son of God as having realized an extraordinarily marvelous deliverance. From this proceeded the necessity of deepening the mysteries surrounding human wretchedness and destiny. Pessimism is the belief in our natural weakness as humans, as well as the determinacy of events unfolding around us. The outcomes are the result of, on one hand, conscious human action, and on the other hand, the governance of the iron laws of the given system. Pessimists, therefore, don't intend to slaughter existing egoists to ensure the happiness of future generations, because he knows his efforts would be in vain, as ultimately only efforts towards disrupting the composite block that constitutes society and reconstituting it are means for social change. Giambattista Vico's work on the study of methods of our time and the new science are two 18th century books that assert a philosophy of historical development, which he attributes to psychological laws which are developed according to providence and the preparation of human consciousness through each stage of history by the emergence of religious juridical forms. While Sorel disagrees with the idealism of Vico as well as much of Vico's methods in general, he does take some interesting concepts from Vico that emerges into Marxism with the pragmatism of William James. One such idea is the Viconian ricorso, or recurrences, which are major upsets in the process of juridical continuity, which is borrowed to conceive the Sorelian idea of revolution as a mass reconstitution of juridical laws which govern social relations. Elan vital is borrowed from Bergson and applied to the social sciences for Sorel's idea of self-governing autonomous syndicates. The excerpt below is a remark on Vico's analysis of the inevitability for democratic and plutocratic societies to bend towards dictatorship and monarchy, an inevitability that Sorel disagrees with but assigns to Vico's laws of royalty. What seemed essential to Vico was the obligation to start with a government of aristocratic barbarism, in order to finish with a civilized monarchical government that would apply natural equity. This is what he called the law of royalty, and he scolded modern interpreters of Roman law for not having recognized it. He returns several times to the law of royalty and gives several explanations. He says first, here is the eternal formula in which nature has conceived it. When the citizens of a democracy no longer consider anything more than their particular interests, and when, to attain this goal, they turn the forces of the nation to the ruin of the country, that a single man rises up who, making himself master through force of arms, takes for himself all public matters and leaves to the subjects only the care of their own particular affairs. This revolution is for the good of the people. When citizens have thus become strangers to their own country, it is necessary that the monarchs direct and represent them. Here we do not quite grasp the thought of the author, who clarifies himself, partly, in another passage. The free power of a state, though which precisely it is free, must in some way realize itself. Thus, all the force that the nobles lose, the people gain, until it becomes free. All that the free people loses goes to the profit of the kings, who finally acquire monarchical power. The natural right of moralists is that of reason. The natural right of peoples is that of utility and of force. But we are still in the process of purely idealist evolutions. Simply because we see the suitability of something, its necessity for the health of the state, it does not necessarily follow that this suitable thing must take place. The proximal cause, the real mediation through which the change takes place, escapes us. I agree with Sorel. Even if the emergence of a powerful monarchy out of a ruinous, plutocratic, and democratic society may seem suitable, it does not necessarily mean that it will happen. However, I do think that we can observe a tendency towards dictatorship out of ruinous, plutocratic societies throughout history, without making it an inevitable law. To better understand what the methodology of Vico and Sorel's have in common and what is different between them, we can look at this next excerpt. There is considerable difference between the modern point of view and Vico's. He believed that psychological evolution took place in one mass, across the whole of society, and developed exactly as the history of the peoples themselves. Once complete, it could not be reproduced unless history began again. Today we see things quite differently. Psychological evolutions are sequences with their own existence and autonomy, arising in any era, mixing in society in the most confused way. Rather than a homogeneous block, we have an interlacing of evolutions, which cannot be brought under any general definition because at any given instant we find them at all moments in their development. But economic conditions, social relations, all the historical complexes act on these evolutions to favor certain developments. Sorel states that while much of Vico's formulas are incorrect, he is still a great man worth studying for his endeavors towards a philosophy of history, as exemplified in the following excerpt. Vico saw very well that events had to be combined. He saw very well that they have to be assembled, according to what is concrete and living, according to what is human, which is to say the laws of psychology. That he did not succeed in his attempts is not important. Glory is secured by having recognized that history has an identity of substance. Of course, he did not understand this identity of substance exactly as the moderns do, but it was not yet possible for him to take, in the first half of the 18th century, the path that Marx would point out in the middle of the next century, a path that even today is little traveled and ill-defined. In Sorel's study of Vico, there is an interesting excerpt that argues against a typical Marxoid talking point that slavery was introduced to society after cannibalism. But this is actually a talking point that comes from Wars, who tries to mix idealism and materialism together, doing so badly even on idealist terms. In a lecture on idealism in history, M. Wars details for us one of his sociological conceptions in which sentiments are considered with as little reality as possible. What was cannibalism, he says? It was doubly contradictory for an obliging man to kill man even outside the excitation of combat. It did violence to the first sentiment of sympathy, moral contradiction. And more, it made of man, who has a certain aptitude for regular labor, production, a sort of beast of prey whose flesh was only useful, economic contradiction. It follows that slavery had to be born because the domestication of man wounded the instinct of sympathy less and was more in the master's interest, in drawing from man through labor much more than his substance could give. It would be useless to ask for historical proof in support of such a poetic conception. The instinct of sympathy and the aptitude for labor are not the motors of man. These things exist only for reflective thought, for the scientist. Moral contradictions bother only the philosopher. Economic contradictions appear only to the economist, and as Vico says, such thinkers came along only after the formation of the classical institutions. Sorel here refutes Wars' idealist notion that the instinct of sympathy and the aptitude for labor are the motors of man, because these things arise, as Vico said, only after the formation of classical institutions. Even by idealist standards, Wars was a terrible idealist. In the next excerpt, Sorel will shed light upon what he borrows from Vico and incorporates into the proletariat, specifically the notions of preparation and juridical reconstitution. It has often been objected to socialists that the proletarian revolution will be obliged to follow the same law that it must take on the ferocious character of a war of extermination, and that it will comprise a European civilization acquired with such patient labor. This reproach will be well-founded if the proletariat was an exalted mass, maddened by idealist preaching, baying for the destruction of worldly things and breaking abruptly with the past under the false pretext of realizing a marvelous plan worked out in some big brain or other. But this is not how it will be, because the first condition of the future revolution is the development in the proletariat of the consciousness of its historical role. The second condition is that the organization of labor by large industry be so adapted to the needs and conditions of the collective production that economic realities constitute the bridge by which the passage from one state to another will take place. Finally, social hierarchies must be no more than shadows. Juridical continuity will not even be violently broken by the proletarian revolution. If contemporary civilization has elaborated a system of laws prudently regulating the regulations between industrialists, the capitalist parts of the codes can disappear, as the feudal regime disappeared, without much troubling juridical ideas. It is therefore of the greatest importance for the socialists to accelerate the movement of juridical reforms and to take what they can get, even if the new laws leave much to be desired. Sorel here says that with the rule of the proletariat, there will be a juridical continuity with only a minor upset caused by the reconstitution of the juridical code without the capitalist laws. This also plays into Sorel's theme that the proletariat will be the inheritors of capitalism and all the fruits of civilization. Sorel was critical of William James. having said that some of his ideas were inadequate as they were based on abstractions and contradictions. George Sorel, however, does still take influence from William James, and assesses his formula's usefulness and the utility of pragmatism. One of the most fruitful advantages that William James claimed for pragmatism, in comparison to all other philosophies, consists in the fact that ours is the only articulate attempt in the field to say positively what truth actually consists of. Our denouncers have literally nothing to oppose to it as an alternative. For them, when an idea is true, it is true, and there the matter terminates. The word true being undefinable, the relation of the true to its object being, as they think, unique, it can be expressed in terms of nothing else, and needs only to be named for anyone to recognize and understand it. Moreover, it is invariable and universal. The same in every single instance of truth, however diverse the reality, the ideas, the realities, and the other relations between them may be. Our pragmatist view, on the contrary, is that the truth relation is a definitively experientiable relation, and therefore describable as well as nameable. It is not unique in kind, and neither invariable nor universal. Sorel endeavors to merge pragmatism with historical materialism, by creating a method by which social activities are grouped into one of four cites, or citizenries, being scholarly, aesthetic, religious, or moral, which are responsible for the creation and preservation of traditions. For the pragmatist, tradition is an element of the highest order in knowledge, provided that the tradition is genuine, that is, that it is a result of trial and error by competent men. Here are three observations which seem to me particularly worthy of mention. Tradition ought to have long since entered into close relations with the life of a glorious cite, scholarly, aesthetic, moral, or religious. It ought to have been personified by men of superior talent. It ought to be rich in good results. When tradition is thus well established, the pragmatist does not hesitate to presume in its favor by virtue of which its affirmations have the right to be received until there are solid proofs to the contrary. This model of the cites is in line with historical materialism's aim to understand social forces, as well as the aim of pragmatism, which is to utilize philosophy for practical use and determine truth by good results. Thus, Sorel takes what is useful from pragmatism and ditches what is not, incorporating it into Marxism. Sorel was a voluntarist and had a voluntaristic view of history. However, we shouldn't confuse Sorel with the voluntarism of the anarchists, who fall into historical nihilism, as Sorel still held that there was a process to history, but nevertheless man is the master of his own destiny. Idealism and determinism produce a fictitious and deceptive continuity. Marx teaches us to seek historical continuity in what is truly real, that is, in men furnished with the means to act upon nature. Men are the actors and the actors of their own drama, and social relationships are also produced by men, just as cloth, linen, etc. The continuity of history manifests itself in two ways: by means of the development of the productive forces which come into being side by side, or by the means of the development of men whose minds become transformed according to psychological laws. This psychological part has been quite neglected by the Marxists, who have, in general, remained aloof from their contemporary philosophical movement. In Marx's time, psychology was little studied by Germans, and few had comprehended the treasures contained in the work of Vico. Here Sorel gives insight into the process that governs history. Man is ultimately the maker of his own destiny. However, their actions and outcomes are governed by, on one hand, the development of the productive forces, and on the other hand, the developmental laws on the psychology of the population. Given that historical progress is the result of conscious effort on the part of man, the hand of the regime of coercion therefore is instrumental in the preparation for a class such as the proletariat to end the regime of coercion, and lead us into a regime of voluntary association. If history is the result of conscious human action, then the most logical mode of social relations is one of voluntary association and free contracts. This is the nature of Sorel's voluntarism, and it is very much inherited from Marx, or at the very least, true to the spirit of Marx. Here in Materials for a Theory of the Proletariat, George Sorel gives us criticism of the democratic socialists and their opposition to federalism. Proudhon's republic contains too many libertarian, anti-militarist, and federalist elements for it to be developed by our modern democrats. who have an unlimited confidence in the economic capacities of the state, are deluded by chauvinism, and are as fanatical about unity as the most ultramontane Catholics. Proudhon believed that the state can usefully intervene in the economy in order to create new institutions, insurance, banks, railroads, etc., but that it should immediately turn over management to citizens. In 1860, he had seen the maneuvers of agents sent by the emperor into Belgium in order to prepare its annexation. He advised the Belgians, like the Swiss, to avoid any act that French chauvinists could interpret as a provocation to justify a war of conquest. He was convinced that the treaties which guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium and Switzerland did not protect the two countries against the veracity of our democracy. Proudhon undoubtedly recognized the impossibility of attaining federalism through democratic development, for he seems to have believed that this regime should be imposed on France by victorious outsiders, just as the parliamentary monarchy had been imposed on our fathers. Here Sorel compares the statist unity of the Democrats to the desires of the ultramontanist Catholics, and holds that, just as Proudhon said the economy should belong to civil society with state interference at a minimum, this demonstrates that while syndicalism is a socialist system that utilizes planning, it is quite libertarian, voluntarist, and laissez-faire outside of decentralized planning for capital goods. George Sorel, although writing little on the composition of a socialist society as he wanted to avoid any utopianism, does give a few insights into what his form of socialism entails. From his constant denunciations against statism and the subordination of production towards social morality, we understand that he is fervently against the state and wishes to impose what he calls the association of producers, a sort of central nexus within a society of autonomous productive federations governed by free contracts. In the quote below from The Socialist Future of the Syndicates, we will examine the attitude Sorel held towards the statist socialists of his time, such as Jean Wars. Sociologists confront socialists with the evidence of all known revolutions and ask how one can accept a hypothesis which is based on no historical example. Marx knew the answer very well, for he wrote, "All social movements until now have been carried out by minorities for the benefit of minorities." This empirical law is easily explained when we recall what state ownership has been in modern history. Moreover, the state has played a substantial role in the formation of present industry. The emerging bourgeoisie could not do without the constant intervention of the state. The thinking of the bourgeois socialists is dominated by the statist prejudices of the bourgeoisie. In a recent book, the most gifted sociologist of the universities, Emile Durkheim, proposes that the organization of corporations and professional federations be subject to the general action of the state. In the conclusions of his speeches of June 19 and 26 and July 3, 1897 on agriculture, Wars proves to be less favorable to the associations than the professor from Bordeaux. He declared that henceforth one can form a rather exact idea of what the socialist world will be. We know that in the property of tomorrow, in the society of tomorrow, the four essential forces which are beginning to form and appear today will combine and function. The first force is the individual, the right of the individual to develop freely without any other limit except to prevent him from exploiting others in any way. There is another element, the emerging syndicates, reactionary today, socialist tomorrow, but in any case, the first units in certain respects of a more collective organization of labor. Then above these agricultural or worker syndicates or professional groupings by trade, there is the town, which in certain respects, and in spite of the division of labor among the diverse parts of the territory, is the first complete unit, richer than the professional organizations, which include only an exclusive and limited element. And finally, above the town, there is the nation, the central organism of unity and perpetuity. It will be noticed that in replacing professional federations by the commune as a middle ground between the local corporations and the state, Wars markedly increases the economic power of the state. I will not stop to discuss in detail this idea which I do not understand clearly. So much is this language devoid of any precision. Besides, is this all really new? Are they not old theories dressed up in beautiful new clothing? The unification of trade associations and the communes seem to be a pure replica of medieval history. If the word nation is changed to kingdom, this becomes a traditional conservative idea. I simply want to call attention to the difficulty which the most intelligent people have in delineating a plan that is independent of traditional political forms. Not only does Wars not exclude the state, but he makes it the regulator and master of industrial life. Here Sorel criticizes the top-down statist models of the bourgeois socialists in France, headed by Jean Wars' French Socialist Party, as being for a feudal regime that constrains the productive forces according to some kind of social morality. This is the sort of socialism that Sorel despised as it conflicted with the élan vital of the proletariat and his socialism of autonomous self-governing federations. Not only this, but he also draws a strong correlation between this corporatist guild administration that Wars presents to be in line with conservative or feudal socialism, which also has the subordination of production in the name of social morality as its aim. For what Sorel would want to replace the state with, he writes later, in a knowledgeable and perspicacious article, Georges Platon wrote, "Revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. It is well said, but as Shakespeare said, words are female and only acts are male." Sorel, however, had his own word for it, the association of producers, a term Marx used as well. In the next excerpt from the Socialist Future of the Syndicates, Sorel writes on the nature of these productive federations. The tactics of the new unions are justified perfectly by the exigencies of the situation, but people have tried to give it a theoretical basis, wrongly so in my humble opinion. Experience having shown how difficult it is to keep workers in syndicates, it seems strange to abandon the mutualist idea. Besides, even in the Dockers Union, which was at first conceived in a spirit entirely opposed to that of the old trade unionism, it was very quickly recognized that it would be useful to give family aid of 100 francs in case of death. In this question, as in all practical questions, we must keep our sense of proportion. The rules of the old unions were not flexible enough. Dues for all benefits should not be made obligatory, so as not to alienate the less fortunate. Only unemployment or health insurance need be mandatory, but types of assistance vary according to circumstances. If quality is an essential element of success in social struggles, as well as in battles, numbers must not be neglected entirely. The question of principles does not appear to be in doubt. To reduce the syndicates to societies of resistance only is to pose a formidable barrier to the development of the proletariat. To open the workers to surrendering to the authoritative influence of bourgeois demagogues by reducing the importance of economic forces which can contribute to maintaining the autonomy of the working class. To prevent it from elaborating new juridical principles in accordance with its own manner of living. In a word, to refuse it to the possibility of becoming a class for itself. The mutual societies founded by the syndicates do not function on the same principles as bourgeois banks. Instead of being inspired by capitalist models, they maintain an appearance of proletarian solidarity. The more they are distinct connections in the unorganized and confused milieu of workers, the more one is sure new elements of social reorganization are being carefully prepared. There is much talk of organizing the proletariat, but to organize does not consist in placing automatons on boxes. Organization is the passage from order, which is mechanical, blind, and determined from the outside, to our organic, intelligent, and fully accepted differentiation. In a word, it is moral development. It is reached only by long practice and experience acquired in life. All institutions are formed in the very same way. They do not result from decisions made by great statesmen any more than by scholars' calculations. They are made by embracing and condensing all the elements of life. On what grounds would the proletariat then escape the necessity of developing itself by this method? One thing has always astonished me, the aversion of many Marxists to cooperatives. They maintain that the workers, once occupied with the minute details of grocery and bakery, would be lost to socialism, and would cease to understand the class struggle. From this desertion would come, at least in Italy, the increasing influence of the petit bourgeois mentality in the Socialist Party. What is the evidence for this lamented desertion? Only one thing, the bad composition of the Italian Socialist Party, and this bad composition has led to numerous articles in Critica Sociale. The test of practice is the true test of ideas. If the workers perceive that their leaders are not capable of directing them, they abandon them as soon as they leave the realm of vague manifestos and come into contact with economic life. The leaders of the socialist movement are supposed to serve men, just as theory exists for practice. What would happen then if after the social revolution, industry should be held by groups who are today incapable of managing a cooperative? Well, Sorel does have his Vosh moment here. He does raise a fair point regarding cooperatives in the sense that while not necessarily being a socialist institution, they do play an important role in dual power in the training of the proletariat to administer production. Furthermore, Sorel describes the role played by syndicates in offering services that the bourgeois socialists wanted offered by the state, such as health and employment insurance. And he talks about the necessary moral development of the proletariat in order for them to be able to self-organize and become a class for itself. This is a recurring talking point in Sorel's writings. Sorel finishes off with the socialist future of the syndicates with this. The development of the proletariat includes a powerful moral discipline exerted on its members. It can be exercised through its syndicates, which are supposed to remove all the forms of organization inherited from the bourgeoisie. In order to sum up my thinking in capsule form, I say that the whole future of socialism rests on the autonomous development of the workers' syndicates. Therefore, we can conclude that Sorelian socialism is a socialism of autonomous self-governing productive units or federations. The organization into syndicates confounds onto the proletariat the development of moral discipline which is required for them to take on the challenges of modern industrial production and become a class for itself. This is the elan vital of which Sorel borrows from Bergson and applies to the social sciences. Despite Sorel being critical of creative evolution, the point is to free civil society from the state and under the autonomous direction of the syndicates allow the emergence of new post-capitalist social relations to emerge. Elan vital is French for vital impetus, a creative energy that Bergson applies to all organisms which is responsible for their self-development. Sorel disagreed with the biology of creative evolution, however, borrowed the term to describe the event after the general strike where the proletariat would organize industry into autonomous productive units, that through the laws of capitalist development would accelerate the breakdown of commodity production, giving way for new post-capitalist social relations to emerge organically. Through this vital impetus of the proletarian syndicates, Sorel also does engage in what can be called Marxist accelerationism, or free time accelerationism, where he says that the social revolution would constitute a lockout of unproductive labor. The intellectuals have professional interests, and not general class interests. These professional interests would be injured by the proletarian revolution. Lawyers would undoubtedly find no place in the future society, and it is not likely that the number of diseases will increase. Progress in science and the better organization of assistants have already had the effect of diminishing the number of doctors utilized. In big industry, many high-level employees could be eliminated if large stockholders did not need to place clients. A better division of labor would allow, as in England, the concentration of the work, now done badly by too many engineers, in a small group of very learned and very experienced technicians. As the character and the intelligence of the workers improves, the majority of the overseers can be eliminated. The English experience abundantly proves it. Finally, for office jobs, women compete actively with men, and these jobs will be reserved for them when socialism emancipates them. Thus, then, the socialization of the means of production would mean a huge lockout. It is difficult to believe that the intellectuals are unaware of a truth as certain as this one. This is the precise aim of syndicalism today, to reduce managerial oversight by utilizing the onset of machine learning and automation, along with the advancement of technical skill and morality of the proletariat, as well as increasing free time by having a more productive economy with limited managerial bureaucracy. Organizing production into autonomous federations would unleash the forces of production and accelerate the socialization process and lock out more unproductive labor and unnecessary managerial oversight. Whatever you may think about George Sorel, whether you disagree with him or you agree with him, you cannot deny that in the early 20th century in France that George Sorel and the Sorelians were the highest authority on Marxism at that time, setting up prominent Marxist journals and working towards translating the works of Marx and Engels into French. Marxist-Leninists object to Sorel's voluntarism, However, much of modern-day Marxist-Leninist theory today is inspired by Sorel, such as the writings of Antonio Gramsci, whose theory of hegemony of the Communist Party and of communist ideas is taken from Sorel's view of the moral preparation of the proletarian class to take hold of modern industry. For Marxist-Leninists, Sorel is like the right libertarian deviant in official Marxism, and certainly not a fascist renegade. It has been claimed that after the CGT capitulated towards democratic social peace that Sorel abandoned Marx for Proudhon, but there is no evidence for this being the case. Sorel was always a Proudhonian Marxist, and he was and will remain a wildcard Marxist, whose writings today are still invaluable for us. Sorelianism today, or Neo-Sorelianism as I have called it, I think remains in the Leninist tradition, because in order to parcel out the current bourgeois socialist holding system into autonomous syndicates, there must first be a popular dictatorship which is capable of doing this. Sorelianism today, however, mostly lives in dual power and the movement to free social life from the state and win over functions for the socialist dual power. Currently, the Infrared Project has a goal of creating an organization which would help fulfill the aims of a dual power, in combination with the attempt to rescue the Communist Party from its current leftist degeneration. Today, Sorelianism stands for free-time accelerationism, shortening the working week, locking out unproductive labor and unnecessary management, and unleashing the forces of production, which includes automation, blockchain technology, and machine learning, which will make labor more productive and autonomous, giving us the preparation for the society of free contracts and autonomous self-governing syndicates. In reconciling the divide between communists and syndicalists, it can be said that in the Sorelian frame of reference, communism is not a final destination, but rather a point of departure. The socialists are strong enough to consider things under the first perspective, but they are deceiving themselves. Communism is a point of departure and not a point of destination. If communism is free time and nothing else as a point of departure, then syndicalism is therefore a world set free as a further stage of development. Syndicalism therefore endeavors to go beyond communism, as syndicalism is communism's libertarian renegade brother. Therefore, Sorelianism today stands for the shortening of the working week, the gradual lockout of unproductive labor and unnecessary managerial oversight, the unleashing of the forces of production, deregulation, balancing the budget, cutting taxes on income, at the most a small and efficient government, a coalition with the libertarians, replacing bourgeois legal code with smart contracts, and parceling out the bourgeois socialist holding system into autonomous self-governing syndicates.
Hey girl, this DJ is so fucking preem. Oh, you think he sucks? Never mind. So this Tru-Dank guy, right? He's talking about this guy, George Sorel, who said that the proletariat must engage in disruptive strikes towards the end of an ideological struggle, towards the myth of the general strike, where the proletariat would halt the entire economy and forcibly seize power over the means of production, constituting a Viconian recorso. Following this, the forces of production would be unleashed, and new juridical concepts premised on the rule of the producers would be instituted, leading to the acceleration of the breakdown of commodity production, leading to new post-capitalist social relations emerging. And this Tru-Dank guy, along with Haas and Jehu, say this breakdown of commodity production already happened in the 1930s when neo-socialists expropriated the gold of the bourgeoisie, transforming us into a fiat system of account economy premised on consumer credit. So we basically already live in socialism. All we gotta do is parcel it out amongst the masses into a syndicalist or communist, whatever you want to call it, productive economy. And we can reduce the working week for more free time, while also being more productive. Sounds fucking preem to me. Hey, where are you going? Fuck.